Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we revisit three segments from our archives that help us understand what is happening today. We talk about extreme rainfalls and how they have been impacting regions like Himachal Pradesh. We also talk about the state of organ donation in India and the factors that affect it. But first, we talk about the Reserve Bank of India. Last week, the RBI was supposed to take a decision regarding its monetary policy rate, also called the repo rate. And we let Indian Express's Udit Misra explain exactly what that is.
So the repo rate is basically the interest rate at which the central bank lends money to the banking system. So just like you and I go to a bank to ask for money and they say that we'll give you these loans at this interest rate, when the banks go to the Reserve Bank charges an interest rate, and that's called the repo rate. So when you raise the repo rate, it typically means that the whole economy through the banks will find the interest rates are going up. And typically, the RBI raises repo rates whenever it wants to bring down inflation by slowing down economic activity.
The idea is that if banks charge people a high interest, then people will borrow less money and therefore they will spend less money. And the overall demand will go down. And like our school textbooks told us, when demand goes down, so does the price of things.
And, that is why this is such an important tool and the central tool that RBI has to control inflation. And it is for this reason that RBI sits every second month to decide on what should be the repo rate, depending on the conditions of the economy, the inflation rate in the economy. And that's why it's so central to monetary policy in the country.
Now, last week, the RBI decided not to change the repo rate at all. It decided that it will remain at 6.5%. But in this segment, we won't be talking about why it chose to do that, and instead focus on the extent to which tweaking the repo rate can help the economy. Because as a tool, the repo rate is not very precise, and it actually has a lot of side effects. In fact, some say that increasing the repo rate can actually end up increasing inequality in a country. Here's the conversation that we had with Udit earlier this year. So, Udit, when we talk about the pros of increasing the repo rate, we know that it reduces inflation, which is good for everyone, right? But what are its cons?
Right. So I think it gets to the distributional aspect of the whole thing. When the RBI raises interest rates, it hits different people differently. If you are about to take a home loan, you are perhaps going to be far more affected than somebody who's just keeping all the money in the bank, because a higher interest rate then pays the saver more, whereas it hits the borrower. So it depends on who is where. And for a growing economy like India, credit is a very important thing. And typically it has been argued in economies like India or say the more advanced economies like US, we've found that when the interest rates are increased and sharply so, it tends to create a certain inequality in the economy, because often people buy assets through credit. For example, a typical asset is buying a house. And if buying a house becomes costlier, not because the house price has gone up, but because your ability to afford that credit has reduced because the credit has become costlier, that affects the ability of people to create assets, to create wealth, and that enlarges the gap between those who already have the benefits or riches and those who didn't have and were looking for cheap credit to get there.
Right, because by increasing the repo rate, you're trying to slow down growth. You're trying to get people to spend less money. And it's all right for a wealthy person to spend less money, but for a person with lesser means, it can hit them pretty hard.
Yes, because this is the importance of credit in a developing economy. You might have all the resources, but you might need timely credit to make use of those resources. You might be a great entrepreneur, you might have a great product, but you might need a certain amount of credit at the right time, or you might want that credit to buy that house, which if you were to save and wait, then it might take you a whole life. And it's only towards the end of that life that you might be able to create that asset. But credit allows you to do that. Now, by raising interest rates, you're just making that thing that much more difficult. And a lot of people who are trying to catch up in the economy and bridge that gap lose out. And that is where inequality comes into picture, because inequality is nothing but the gap between the haves and the have-nots.
Okay, so we have established that increasing the repo rate seems to increase inequality. But does that mean that reducing the repo rate decreases inequality?
So that's actually the funny thing, because while a lot of research is now coming out, which is saying that increasing interest rates is increasing inequality, what we have seen in the recent past, in the last decade or so, since the global financial crisis, is that a lot of central banks were cutting interest rates. Interest rates in the West, in particular the US central bank, made interest rates near about zero. So for the longest time, we saw economic growth happening because interest rates were at zero. And a lot of literature in countries like the US was arguing that keeping interest rates so low is increasing inequalities. And this is counterintuitive. Now, by the same logic, you would think that people will be able to afford a house. But typically what happens is that when you keep interest rates low, lot of appreciation, asset creation happens in the stock market. You spend a lot of money. All that money basically means profits of companies are improving. That reflects in the stock market. And so the argument goes that most of the asset creation or wealth creation that is happening happens in the stock market and when the interest rates are low. And who owns the stocks predominantly? It's the rich. So inequality goes up, not because you are able to afford a house, but because the rich become even richer.
So basically all the money that the central banks are letting into the system by decreasing interest rates, the rich are the ones that are able to take a lot more advantage of it.
Exactly. So you think of yourself, and listeners can think of themselves and think when the interest rates are brought down quite considerably between a big industrialist in India and them and their maid, the person who benefits the most is somebody who has plans and the ability to leverage based on that low interest rate. You might be able to buy a house. Your maid might not be even getting into that situation, but the big industrialist might be launching a new company or a totally different corporate empire. And the returns as a result are skewed totally in favor of those who are already rich and capable of making use of cheap money.
Okay, so clearly in this case, we find ourselves in a damned if you do, damned if you don't sort of situation. So what should the RBI do? Are we just doomed for failure in this case?
So there are two ways to look at this. One is that, and I've quoted last year's Nobel winner and former Fed chairman Ben Bernanke in this, where he says that, first of all, central banks are not supposed to primarily care for inequality. They're supposed to care for price stability, that the inflation does not go haywire. And they should continue doing that. And now what happens to inequality? Because there is such a muddied situation in terms of what happens to inequality, he recommends that it should be the government that should try to address the situation of inequality. So instead of monetary tools, which is about money supply, we should use fiscal tools, which are about government taxation and government expenditure. You can tax the rich more, transfer that money in some way to the poor, or use that money to create assets like a road or a bridge, which enhances the ability of the relatively poorer people to come up to a higher level of earning. The other way, within the bounds of what a central bank can do, is something that we also saw during the COVID period. We saw RBI doing it, is when the RBI can mandate, or a central bank can mandate, that I'm flooding the market with money because the economic growth is struggling. I'm saying that I'll give you a certain quantum of money, but I'm also putting a condition that 50% of this or 25% of this must go to MSMEs, smaller businesses, or it should go to people with total incomes less than this or that.
Yeah, and by doing that, you're addressing the side effects of increasing the repo rate, which is supposed to bring down the price of things, but again, as a way, affects the poor a lot more.
Exactly, because repo rate is a blunt instrument. It can raise rates for everybody and bring them down for everybody. Now, how do you deal with the side effects, as it were, or the implications of that, depending on where different people are? And different economies have different levels of inequalities. Some economies like India have massive inequalities. So we'll have to perhaps be more cognizant of the impact of what a sharp rise in repo rate or a sharp fall in repo rate does to our economy. Because with inequalities, it's not just an economic phenomena, it becomes a social unrest or a social problem.
And next, we talk about extreme rainfalls. In the last few days, incessant rainfall has wreaked havoc in North India. At the time of this recording, over 50 people have been killed in Himachal Pradesh as heavy rains battered the hill state and triggered landslides that blocked key roads and brought down houses. And in Uttarakhand, the heavy rainfall swept away a road connecting Dehradun and Rishikesh. In fact, the rainfall has been so severe that the Dehradun Defence College building collapsed because of it. Now, such incidents are obviously not new. Since the last decade, India has witnessed at least one extreme rain related event every year.
Since 2013, for example, that's a big marker because 2013 had the Uttarakhand tragedy, the huge flooding and disaster in Uttarakhand in 2013, starting from Kedarnath. So if we take that as the start year, then every following year, without fail, actually, every single year in India has produced at least one major extreme rainfall event.
That's Indian Express's Amitabh Sinha, who we had spoken to last month about this problem. Here's an excerpt from that conversation.
The famous ones, people would be able to recall very easily. Immediately after Uttarakhand in 2013, Kashmir was flooded, Srinagar was flooded. Now, Kashmir Valley usually don't get flooding, but 2014, Srinagar had unprecedented flooding. That was immediately after Uttarakhand. Then, of course, you had Chennai floodings in 2015, made international headlines. Now, it was a big event. Then, of course, 2018, Kerala. Kerala gets huge rainfall every year. But in 2018, that turned into a disaster. Lots of flooding, huge amount of property got destroyed. So those were big events.
And besides this, such events have also taken place in Bengaluru, Pune, Delhi, Gurgaon, Bihar, and Assam.
So across the country, we have had major rainfall events which have resulted in floodings and disaster-like situations.
And he says that this trend is very much in line with what scientists have been warning us for years and should be seen in the context of climate change.
Scientists have been warning us for a fairly long time now that these kind of events would become more and more normal, that they will become more and more frequent and will get normalized. And when I say these kind of events, in the context of rainfall, the events that we are talking about is about extreme rainfall events. Their frequency and intensity both are supposed to increase under climate change circumstances.
So this means very heavy rainfall over short periods of time.
So instead of, say, getting 100 millimeters of rain over 20 days, now you are getting 100 millimeters of rain within 5 days or 6 days. So the extreme rainfall events wherein you get very, very heavy rainfall within a short period of time, those kind of events have been on the increase, not just in India, but everywhere else. And this is something that is very well predicted by climate change scientists.
And these events are unavoidable and will continue to take place in the future as well. But Amitabh says that what can be minimized is the destruction that comes along with it, especially in urban areas.
A lot of the situation that develops as a result of heavy rainfall in the urban areas are easily avoided, and they are a result of neglect, official apathy, that just the lack of application of some basic civic rules. That's the reason why we see flooding in Bengaluru every year, flooding in Gurgaon, flooding in Delhi, flooding in Mumbai. So a lot of these things, even the flooding in what we saw in Srinagar, for example, or Kerala, they were aggravated because of human errors. it wasn't just the rainfall. Of course, the rainfall did play a major contribution, and that was the trigger, of course. But the way we have developed our cities, allowing construction in areas which should ideally have been no-go areas from the point of view of construction, riverbeds, for example, in Kerala in 2018, and lots of houses or hotels got destroyed because they were built on the floodplains. And usually for very long, actually, the river was not flowing in full force. And therefore, parts of the floodplains, they remained dry for a very long time, and people went and built on those areas. Now, of course, the civic authorities should not have allowed those kind of things to happen. And once the river comes in full flow, then there is very little that can be done about it.
And he says this is exactly what happened in Srinagar as well, where there are a lot of overpopulated areas near the river Jhelum, and which have witnessed flooding this time.
And those areas are not meant to be populated. Over the years, these have developed into residential colonies, commercial centers, all sorts of things. And suddenly when the water came in Jhelum and it spilled over onto outside the river, these areas got flooded and there was no exit for the water. So it remained flooded for a very long time. So a lot of these kind of bad planning turns out to be aggravating factors in situations like this. That's why I say that you can't do much about heavy extreme rainfall events, but certainly the floodings, and especially the urban floodings, is something that surely can be dealt with. All of this is part of larger civic apathy and the lack of application of basic civic rules. Mumbai has a drainage problem. Pune has a different kind of problem, but all of them are solvable and all of them have resulted because basic rules have been violated in these cities.
And in the end, we talk about organ donations. Last Sunday, the 13th of August, marked the World Organ Donation Day, which is celebrated to sensitize people about how crucial organ donation is to save lives and improve the quality of life for individuals suffering from organ failure and chronic diseases. And Indian Express's Anona Dutt says that this is especially important for India, which needs to increase the number of deceased donations.
Because if you see in other countries, most of the organs actually come from deceased donors. Whereas in India, the deceased donation is hardly 20%. That was at a peak. And 80% of the donations are from living donors. What NATO, which is the National Organ and Tissue Transplantation Organization, is trying to do is promote organ donation in people so that people pledge their organs, and in case they meet with an accident, which is the most common cause of brain death in people who have relatively healthy organs. So if they are aware about organ donation, they can plan ahead, they can inform their families that that is something they would like to do so that deceased donations go up in India.
But she says that there are many challenges that people face in trying to do that.
So everyone can pledge their organs with Noto. There is a tab on their website and you can get a organ donor card made there. But even if you do that, it is really important that your family consents to the donation after you have passed away. And no center, to my mind, would do it without the consent of the family members. So it is important, and that is what even Noto says when they say that, okay, you're pledging your organ. But make sure you tell your parents, you tell your spouse or partner that, this is something that you would want to do, because the decision, after all, actually lies with the family members after the death. Other than that, I guess now with the law for living will, one can leave behind a legal document stating that they would like to donate organ. So it is a document where you can state that, okay, if I have so-and-so condition, please don't use extraordinary measures and things like that. You can mention what kind of interventions you would like, and you can also mention whether you would like to donate your organs, your body, etc. in the living will.
She says as far as trends go, right now the highest number of organ donations come from southern states.
And the data shows, I think the highest is in Telangana, then Tamil Nadu, Karnataka. In fact, Chennai is one of the leading centers for organ transplant in India. Then after the southern states, it's the western states where a high number of donations happen. Say it's like Maharashtra and Gujarat see a lot of donations. Then it is the north and then the east. So this is a pattern that has existed for years. And this is something that happens even in case of both, because the transplant centers are also sort of located in these geographical areas. These see a lot of living donor transplants, because the teams are there, but also when we see deceased donations, which is something about awareness and people actually consenting to donations. That is also something we see is the highest in the south, then the west, and then the north. So this is a pattern that has existed, and I don't know what particular reason there is for that other than, I guess, awareness.
You were listening to Three Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Abhishek Kumar and was produced by Utsa, Sarmin and me, Shashank Bhargava. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcast. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it. Share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.